Welcome back to the complete online dressage course by How to Dressage. Now in this presentation, we're going to be giving you an introduction into the scales of training. Now this is probably the most important module in the course, and it's one of the reasons why this module will be free forever. If you complete no other module, make sure you at least complete this one, because it is so important to your training. So in this presentation, we're going to start by covering what the scales of training are. We're then going to take a look at how the scales are interlinked and how they work together. We're then going to see why the scales are important for your horse's well-being and also why they are important for competitive dressage. So with all of that to get through, let's get going. So to kickstart us off, exactly what are the scales of training? Well, they've actually got a couple of names. They're sometimes called the German scales of training, and they're also called the training pyramid. But essentially, the 6 scales are designed to facilitate the correct physical and mental development of the dressage horse. And when you use them correctly, they create an equine athlete who works in perfect balance and makes the most of the movement that they naturally possess. In essence, for your horse to achieve his maximum potential, it's crucial that you work methodically through the scales, making steady progress. And the scales give you that framework to help you train correctly in that logical order. Now, if a rider does not know the training scales inside and out, then they are unable to help themselves or their horse. This is how important these scales are. They should form the basis of all of your training, and also we will mention them numerous times throughout this course because they apply to every movement and every transition that you ride. So here's what they are. Now, they're usually pictured in a pyramid, which is what we've shown on screen. And the first scale at the bottom is rhythm. The second scale is suppleness. The third scale is contact. The fourth scale is impulsion. The fifth one is straightness. And the sixth one is collection. Now we are going to go through each of those scales individually and in depth throughout this module. So we have got a presentation on each one. We're going to cover exactly what they are and also how you can achieve each scale. Now as you progress through the training scales, your horse will move into a balance which is both functional and beautiful. And the ultimate goal is to get to the top, which is collection. Now these scales are meant to be approached in a systematic order. Now although there is the odd occasion where one can be skipped over in order to work on improving another one, in essence there are no shortcuts. You've got to start from the bottom and work your way up to the top. Now within this course, we've also added in another scale. And we've called it the hidden scale, scale 0. And in that one, we're going to talk about relaxation. Now, technically, relaxation doesn't appear in the actual scales. But you could argue that if you don't have relaxation, then you wouldn't get a good tempo and a good rhythm, and your horse wouldn't be supple. And therefore, you wouldn't be able to achieve the first 2 training scales anyway. However, relaxation is so important, and because of that, we need to cover it separately. Hence why we've called it the hidden scale, scale 0, and we will be doing a presentation solely on relaxation in the next video. And in that video, we will tell you more about it, how to achieve it, because without that relaxation, you won't even get onto the training pyramid. Now it's also important to note that the training pyramid can also be broken down into 3 separate phases. So this first one of rhythm, suppleness and contact can also be called the familiarization phase, the training phase, and also the phase of developing understanding and confidence. Basically, this is where your horse is becoming familiar with carrying your weight on his back, and he's developing an understanding of your aids, how to work between them, and he's also learning how to trust you. And then we move on to the second phase, and this is made up of suppleness, contact, impulsion, and straightness. And this is where your horse starts to develop the pushing power, and this is where he learns how to engage his hind legs, and where we really start to be able to influence the horse's way of going. And then the third and final phase is made up of impulsion, straightness, and collection. And this is also known as the carrying phase. And this is where the horse learns the ability to shift his weight back onto his hind legs, which is necessary for the more advanced movements and for you to further improve the horse's balance. Now, another thing to know about the scales of training is that they are all interlinked. So until your horse is working in a good rhythm, he will not be able to become supple. And until your horse is supple, the contact will be inconsistent. And until the contact is established, then impulsion will not be true. And if the horse is not working through a supple back, forwards with impulsion to a consistent elastic contact, then he will not be straight. And only when a horse is established in the preceding 5 scales will he be able to become sufficiently collected enough to perform the advanced work that is demanded by the higher level tests. So here you can see how all the scales work together. And it also proves that if you are having a problem achieving one of the scales, then the fault could be with one of the previous scales. For example, if you are having trouble achieving a consistent contact, then the fault usually isn't with the contact itself, but usually with one of the previous scales. So it could be a problem with suppleness, or with the rhythm, or with that scale 0 of relaxation. So even though you can see how the scales interlink, they also help you to make progress because they help you to identify problems. Now that leads us nicely into this next slide, which is how we go about using the scales of training. So as we mentioned, the scales help you in your training because they give you a framework and a progression. And they're also proof of good work, because just how we showed you in the previous slide, that if something is not working, it could be a fault of one of the previous scales. On the flip side of that, if something is working, then it usually proves that you've got the previous scales correct. So not only do they help you identify problems, they can also help you to justify when your work is going in the correct direction. Okay, so now let's move on to the next part of this presentation, where we're going to talk about the scales of training and your horse's well-being. So, training your horse along the scales will ensure that he gradually becomes physically supple and strong enough to be able to do the work required at each level without sustaining injury. Now, if you try to take shortcuts, you can cause serious problems for your horse. For example, if you try to pull the horse's head down into an outline, and I say the word outline in inverted commas, then you could cause him to tighten and hollow his back. He will trail his hind quarters and he will lose regularity in the rhythm, and the horse will usually open his mouth against the contact. He may tilt his head and may even drop behind the vertical to escape the rider's hands. Now, the end result of that scenario is not only a low mark in a dressage test, but also a very miserable horse with a sore mouth and a sore back. Now, in contrast, A correctly trained horse is less likely to sustain long-term physical problems. He will be much happier in his work, and his dressage career is also likely to be longer, compared with the example of the rider who has taken shortcuts. And this is the reason why progressing through the scales in the correct order is so important, because by doing so, you're making sure that the work you're asking of your horse is enough for him. It's not too much to stress him or cause him injury. It's work that he can comfortably do while still allowing both of you to progress. So that covers your horse's well-being. Now let's take a look at the training scales and dressage competitions. So, dressage judges are trained to assess the horse's performance and the way of going against the scales of training. The very first centerline in every dressage test gives a clear indication to the judge of how well the horse has been trained in line with the scales of training. So, before your next dressage competition, take a closer look at the test that you will be riding. And you'll notice that every movement is designed to test how correctly the horse has been trained along these scales. So for example, if you go and get a British dressage test sheet, if you take a look in the directives column and also in the collective marks, you'll notice the words of rhythm, suppleness, contact, impulsion, straightness and collection. And you'll also notice that the words you see will be relative to the level of training expected from the horse. So at the lower levels, you won't see the words collection, but instead they will focus on the scales of rhythm, suppleness and contact, which as we've seen earlier, are the foundation. Now once you understand these scales, you will understand why you get the dressage scores that you do, and also how to go about improving on those scores. In other words, you will know what the dressage judges are looking for, which tends to be like a holy grail because people think that it's a big mystery about what the judges want to see, when in essence, all they want to see is correct training along these dressage scales of training. Now, before we wrap this presentation up, we've just got one more final note when it comes to these training scales. And that is to not rush the scales. So when you are schooling your horse, it's important to accept that you won't be able to achieve all of these training scales and achieve the correct way of going overnight. It's a process that takes many months and years, but your patience will be rewarded in the long run, because your horse will start to make quicker progress provided that your foundation work has been done correctly. Now in contrast, if you try and rush the process, this will often lead to resistance and resentment on the part of the horse. Instead, remember that the scales are created to develop the horse's physical and mental abilities, and this allows him to make that steady progress up the levels with very little stress. If you try to rush that process, then you will create additional stress that isn't needed, and you will have that resistance in the horse. So think of these scales as your building blocks, and that solid foundation will be there for everything that you want to do with your horse in the future, whether that's dressage or any other discipline. However, if that foundation has been built on shortcuts, you will not make progress. And in the terms of competition, experienced judges will easily notice incorrect training. Now, the last thing to note is that you will never complete the scales, in the same way that you will never score 100% in a dressage test. Even the top riders in the world are constantly fine-tuning and improving their horse's way of going and performances against the scales of training. Even if you are competing at Grand Prix level, you will still be thinking about relaxation, rhythm, suppleness, contact, impulsion, straightness, collection, every single scale. It's not a case of achieving the first scale. So for example, saying, oh, now we've got a good rhythm, let's move on to the second scale and forget about the first one. You will always be working through the scales and you will always be fine-tuning them. You will never be complete. So to summarize this presentation, the dressage scales of training are rhythm, suppleness, contact, impulsion, straightness, and collection. And remember that we've added an extra scale at the beginning, scale 0 of relaxation. And all of those scales are linked and they're designed to be worked through in that order. And remember that they're designed to gradually develop the horse's physical and mental abilities so that he makes steady progress up the levels without sustaining injury and without stress. Now lastly, the scales are never completed, they're merely refined, and dressage judges use the scales of training when they are scoring dressage tests. Now, as mentioned in the introduction, we're going to go through each of these scales individually and we're going to take a look more in depth at how you can achieve each one. So we look forward to seeing you in those presentations. Now this video was created by How To Dressage, and if you would like to continue with this course, then please visit course.howtodressage.com. Thank you very much for watching.